When you cry in silence, the presence of God keeps you company and eases your pain. There are moments in life when silence feels heavier than any word spoken, nights when the room seems too still, and yet the heart is a battlefield of emotions impossible to contain. It is in those moments, when tears fall quietly down your face and no one seems to notice, that the soul begins to ask, does anyone see me? Does anyone hear me? Does anyone truly know the weight I am carrying? That question echoes like thunder in the silence, and yet without fanfare, without visible proof, something profound begins to happen. When you cry in silence, the presence of God does not wait to be invited. It comes gently, like a soft hand laid upon a trembling shoulder, like a warmth that enters a cold room without anyone opening a door. You may believe that your pain is too small, too hidden, too unworthy of divine attention, but the truth is the opposite. The very act of breaking in silence, of letting your tears fall without words, becomes the prayer you didn't know how to form. God listens to that language, because tears carry meanings the mouth could never arrange. Modern psychology tells us that crying is not weakness, but release. Judith S. Beck often reminded us that acknowledging pain rather than suppressing it is the first step toward healing. Neuroscience confirms this truth. As Andrew Huberman explains, the body and brain reset themselves through tears. Chemicals that cause stress are literally carried away, creating space for clarity. And yet, there is more than biology at play. That emptiness left behind is not just vacant, it becomes a chamber for God's presence to fill. Think of the moments you have broken down in silence. Remember the stillness that followed after the sobbing ended. Did you not feel something you could not name? A strange peace, a sudden sense that you were not entirely alone. This is where human science and divine mystery meet. The Stoics would say pain is an inevitable tutor, sharpening the mind and humbling the heart. Descartes would argue that even in despair, our awareness of suffering proves the undeniable truth of our existence. But faith carries it further. Faith says that existence is not solitary, that your pain is witnessed by one who never leaves. So the next time you find yourself crying in silence, remember this: you are not performing an act of isolation, but of communion. Every tear becomes a signal to heaven. Every sob is heard, even when no one else is near. And in that moment, you may discover that the presence of God is not dramatic or loud. It is steady, it is quiet. It is the companion who sits beside you, eases your pain, and transforms your solitude into connection. The echo of tears in silence. When a tear falls in silence, it seems to vanish without leaving a trace. Yet what appears invisible carries an echo more powerful than any spoken word. The human mind is trained to believe that what is not seen does not exist. But silence has its own resonance, one that vibrates within the soul and expands beyond what reason can measure. Every drop that escapes your eyes carries a message, a code that your heart cannot fully translate, but your Creator understands without effort. In cognitive psychology, unspoken emotions are known to create deep imprints. David M. Clark explains how unexpressed pain generates cycles of thought that trap the mind, building invisible walls around the self. When those walls hold too tightly, the tears finally flow, and that release becomes the breaking of chains that words could not break. Tears, then, are not signs of collapse but signals of liberation. They echo first in your chest, then in the silence of your room, and finally, in a dimension beyond your senses. Think of the stillness after crying. It is not the same silence as before. It is heavier, yet clearer. Neuroscientists like Andrew Huberman describe how after a wave of emotion, the nervous system begins to regulate itself, shifting from chaos toward balance. That shift is not only physiological, it is also spiritual. The silence that follows crying is a transformed silence, no longer empty but alive, carrying the imprint of your suffering upward, as if the room itself had absorbed your pain and lifted it into the presence of God. The echo of your tears does not fade into nothingness. It travels like sound waves unseen, reaching places your logic cannot. The Stoics believed that inner struggles could refine a person more deeply than external victories, and they were right. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the soul becomes stronger not by what is easy but by what it endures. When you weep in silence, your tears are not wasted drops. They are the instruments through which your soul learns resilience and through which God sends back his comfort. To believe that no one hears is natural, but it is also incomplete. What you feel as silence is, in fact, resonance. What you think is absence is, in truth, presence. Every cry, even the one muffled into a pillow, reverberates in eternity, and that echo is what invites the presence of God to draw near. The moment when the heart breaks. There comes a moment when the weight is too heavy, when no reasoning can hold the walls together, and the heart simply breaks. It is not the dramatic kind of break that others can see. It is subtle, almost hidden, felt only in the deepest chambers of your chest. You know it because suddenly breathing feels heavier, time slows, and you realize that nothing around you can distract you from what is happening inside. As Andrew Huberman explains, stress and emotional collapse trigger neurochemical shifts that prime the brain for adaptation. In other words, what feels like destruction may actually be the ground preparing for growth. Philosophy has long taught us this paradox. Aristotle believed that every form of pain carries within it a hidden telos, a purpose. The Stoics affirmed that when life crushes you, it also reveals what is indestructible within you. And Descartes, with his radical doubt, would remind us that the very act of recognizing your own despair proves the undeniable fact of your existence and your capacity to rebuild. The heart's breaking moment is therefore not the end of your story, but the doorway into a deeper awareness of yourself and of God's presence. Think of your own breaking moments. Weren't they the times when, stripped of control, you felt a mysterious closeness, a presence you could not fully explain? That is because brokenness creates openness. The fracture of the heart allows light to enter, a divine companionship to slip in where pride or self-sufficiency once stood. In the very second you thought you had lost everything, you unknowingly made space for the one who never abandons you. The moment when the heart breaks is not final. It is sacred. It is the point where human limitation meets divine intervention, where despair transforms into the possibility of renewal. And in that silence, as the tears fall, you are not alone. You are being carried into the awareness that God was already there, waiting to transform your pain into strength. The science of solitude and the voice of God. Solitude has often been feared, as if being alone meant being abandoned. Yet science shows us that solitude is not simply emptiness. It is an active state of the mind and body. When you are alone, your brain shifts into what neuroscientists call the default mode network, the state where reflection, memory, and self-awareness become most active. Andrew Huberman explains that in these quiet spaces, the brain recalibrates, reorganizes thoughts, and processes emotions that daily distractions suppress. What feels like painful isolation is, in fact, the mind doing its deepest work. But there is something more profound happening beyond neurons firing in silence. In solitude, stripped from external noise, you are finally able to hear what is not usually audible, the gentle voice that does not compete with chaos. Cognitive behavioral therapy highlights that when external reinforcements are absent, your inner dialogue grows louder, shaping your perception of reality. For those who cultivate faith, this inner dialogue becomes the opening through which the voice of God can be discerned, not as an audible sound, but as clarity, conviction, or peace that arises seemingly out of nowhere. The Stoics considered solitude as a test of the soul. Marcus Aurelius reflected that a man finds his strength not in the applause of others, but in what he can withstand alone. Modern psychology agrees. It is often in moments of isolation that resilience is built. Yet faith elevates this further, because solitude does not have to mean separation. It can mean communion with the divine, where what is absent in human form is replaced by an unseen presence. Think of your loneliest moments. Weren't they also the times when an unexpected thought of hope, a sudden sense of calm, or a deep inner knowing arose? That was not coincidence. That was the voice of God finding room in your solitude. Silence created the stage. Your tears became the script, and his presence was the actor stepping into the scene. So solitude, far from being your enemy, becomes the sacred environment where the noise of the world fades and the eternal voice can be heard. In that stillness, you realize that what felt like abandonment was actually an invitation to discover that you were never truly alone. Tears as the hidden language of the soul. Tears are often dismissed as weakness, but in truth they are a language older than words. Long before you spoke your first sentence, you cried. Crying is the primal expression of need, pain, and longing, and it remains the most authentic voice of the human heart. When words fail, tears step forward as the hidden vocabulary of the soul. They are not random drops of water. They are encoded with emotion, carrying meanings that bypass the intellect and reach directly into the spiritual dimension. Psychologists like Judith S. Beck have shown that suppressing emotion distorts thought patterns and feeds cycles of anxiety and despair. Tears disrupt that cycle. They serve as a release valve for emotions too complex to articulate, allowing the body and mind to realign. Science confirms what the spirit has always known: tears cleanse. Andrew Huberman explains that crying reduces levels of stress hormones, rebalances the nervous system, and often brings an afterwave of calm, as if the body itself were saying, "I have been heard." But beyond biology, tears speak to the divine. The Bible portrays God as the one who counts and keeps every tear, acknowledging them as precious records of human struggle. To him, your tears are not weakness, but prayer. They are confessions without words, petitions without language, offerings without ritual. This is why, when you cry in silence, you may feel a peace that words could never summon. The soul has spoken in its native tongue, and God has responded in his. Think of the last time you wept in solitude. Did you notice how the tears carried emotions you could not have explained to anyone else? They said what your mind could not arrange into speech. That is the secret power of crying. It bypasses human explanation and goes straight to divine translation. Tears are the bridge between suffering and healing, between loneliness and divine company. So do not despise your tears. They are not evidence of failure, but proof that your soul is alive, reaching outward and upward. Each drop is a syllable in the hidden language of the heart, and every syllable is perfectly understood by God. The silence that heals inner chaos. There is a kind of silence that suffocates, the one born from loneliness and despair. But there is also another kind of silence, one that does not oppress, but heals. This silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of order after disorder, the calm that comes when the storm inside finally loses its strength. When your tears fall and exhaustion empties your heart, silence often follows. And in that silence, something remarkable takes place. The mind and soul begin to reorganize themselves. Neuroscience reveals that the brain, after intense emotional release, enters a phase of recalibration. Andrew Huberman explains that in moments of stillness after emotional storms, the nervous system shifts toward parasympathetic states, where healing, clarity, and restoration occur. In other words, what feels like emptiness is actually the body's laboratory, silently repairing what pain has damaged. Psychology confirms this too. Cognitive restructuring often emerges after silence, when the mental noise has finally quieted enough for new perspectives to form. But beyond science, silence is also a sacred atmosphere. It is the place where the whispers of God are most easily perceived. Words can distract, noise can drown meaning. Yet in silence, the smallest impression feels magnified. A sudden thought of hope, a gentle reassurance, or a calming of fear, these become audible only when the inner chaos is hushed. The Stoics called this tranquility of the soul, the state where one is no longer enslaved by the turmoil of circumstances. Faith deepens it, teaching that silence is not just tranquility but communion, a place where the eternal presence of God can be felt without interference. Think of the times when you emerged from deep pain into silence. Did you not notice that clarity arrived, as if answers you had chased so hard came softly on their own? That is the healing power of silence. It organizes the fragments of thought, soothes the battered emotions, and opens the heart to the presence of the divine. The silence that heals is not passive, it is active restoration. It is God's workshop in the soul, repairing without tools, comforting without noise, and guiding without words. When inner chaos collapses into quiet, the transformation begins. and you discover that silence itself was the medicine you needed. The invisible strength of divine companionship. There are moments when the weight of solitude feels unbearable, when every voice around you fades and you are left with nothing but your pain. Yet in that emptiness, an invisible strength emerges. You cannot see it with your eyes or measure it with instruments, but you can feel it pressing gently against the fragility of your heart. This is the companionship of God, quiet, unwavering, and strong enough to hold you when you cannot hold yourself. Modern psychology teaches that perceived support can significantly reduce emotional suffering. Even when no one is physically present, the belief that you are not entirely alone changes how the brain processes pain. David M. Clark explains that the human mind interprets isolation differently when it feels anchored to a secure connection. Neuroscience adds to this understanding. Studies show that social bonds, or even the perception of them, reduce stress responses in the body. In faith, that bond takes its ultimate form in the unseen presence of God, a presence that is never absent, even when all human support fails. The Stoics believed that inner strength was enough to carry a person through trials, but even they acknowledged the value of aligning with a higher order of nature, something larger than the self. Faith brings this truth to its fullness. The higher order is not just impersonal nature, but a personal God who stands beside you in the shadows of your pain. When you cry alone, you may feel abandoned by the world, but you are simultaneously accompanied by the divine. Think of how many times you have survived what you thought would destroy you. If you look closely, you will notice that strength came from a place beyond your own reserves. That is not illusion. It is the evidence of invisible companionship. God does not always announce his presence with thunder. More often he arrives as the stillness that holds you together, the resilience that lifts you when you collapse, the whisper that keeps you moving forward. The invisible strength of divine companionship is not something you need to earn. It is already there, constant, ready. It is what keeps your soul from disintegrating, even when your circumstances tell you otherwise. And when you finally recognize it, your solitude transforms not into loneliness, but into communion with the one who never leaves. The transformation of burden into purpose. Every pain you carry feels at first like a weight designed only to crush you. The silent tears, the sleepless nights, the heaviness in your chest. Each one seems like proof that life is unfair and unbearable. Yet over time, if you allow yourself to look deeper, you begin to notice that the very burden threatening to break you can also reshape you. This is the mystery of transformation. Suffering, when carried into the presence of God, does not end in destruction, but in meaning. Psychology describes this as post-traumatic growth. Judith S. Beck emphasizes that crises, though destabilizing, often create the conditions for new cognitive frameworks, new ways of thinking about life, self, and purpose. Neuroscience confirms that the brain is capable of rewiring itself through neuroplasticity, turning pain into fuel for resilience and strength. What the mind once labeled as unbearable becomes the very soil where new strengths and insights grow. Philosophy has long taught this paradox. Aristotle believed that adversity shapes character, forcing the soul to expand where it once resisted. The Stoics spoke of pain as raw material for virtue, transforming trials into endurance, courage, and wisdom. And faith elevates this further by declaring that nothing is wasted in God's hands. The tears that once seemed meaningless are woven into a larger design, creating purpose where only chaos appeared before. Think about the burdens you have carried. Did they not push you into deeper reflection, force you to reevaluate priorities, and perhaps even lead you toward a calling you would have never discovered otherwise? Many who have suffered the most are often those who later comfort others with profound compassion. This is the divine exchange. Weight becomes testimony, pain becomes empathy, tears become seeds of purpose. So when you find yourself bowed under the weight of sorrow, remember that it is not simply pressing you down. It is shaping you, refining you, and preparing you for a higher meaning. The burden you carry in silence today may one day become the very reason someone else finds strength to continue. And in that transformation, you realize that what once felt like punishment was, in truth, preparation. The body that cries, the soul that restores. When tears fall, it is not only the heart that speaks, but also the body that heals. Crying is often dismissed as weakness, yet science shows it is one of the most profound mechanisms of restoration built into human design. Andrew Huberman explains that emotional tears contain stress hormones and toxins, which means every drop released is the body's way of cleansing itself from inner overload. The nervous system, once agitated, gradually shifts into a calmer state, allowing the mind to breathe again. But the miracle of crying does not stop with biology. The body may release chemicals and restore equilibrium, but the soul undergoes a parallel process. The act of weeping humbles the human spirit, tearing down illusions of control and opening a door to dependence on something greater than the self. In cognitive behavioral therapy, practitioners like Judith S. Beck emphasize that allowing oneself to fully experience emotion rather than repressing it breaks cycles of internal distortion. Crying is not regression. It is an act of acknowledgement, a declaration that something within matters enough to be felt deeply. Philosophy, too, aligns with this. Michel de Montaigne wrote that acknowledging our fragility is what makes us truly human. Aristotle saw catharsis, emotional release, as essential for moral and spiritual balance. And faith takes this principle into its most intimate form. God does not reject tears, He honors them. The scriptures declare that He collects them, that not one drop is wasted. To Him, your crying is both a biological necessity and a spiritual offering. Think of the last time you wept until you felt emptied. Didn't you notice a strange peace afterward, even if your circumstances had not changed? That was your body restoring itself, and your soul finding space to be touched by divine presence. Crying unites the physical and the spiritual in a single act. The body sheds weight, the soul receives renewal. So never despise your tears. They are a testimony that you are alive in every dimension, physical, emotional, and spiritual. When the body cries, the soul restores. And in that restoration, God draws near, healing both what can be measured by science and what can only be known by faith. The meeting between vulnerability and hope. There is a sacred moment that happens when vulnerability and hope collide. Vulnerability is what you feel when your defenses collapse, when your tears expose the parts of you that you would rather keep hidden. Hope is the quiet conviction that despite the pain, there is still light waiting beyond the shadows. When the two meet, transformation begins. It is in your most fragile moments that the seed of hope finds its richest soil. Psychology teaches that vulnerability is not weakness, but authenticity. David M. Clark reminds us that when we expose the truth of our pain, we open the path for change and healing. Hiding emotions may seem safer, but it traps us in cycles of fear and shame. Neuroscience supports this idea. The brain thrives when uncertainty is met with meaning, and vulnerability creates the environment for hope to rewire neural circuits toward resilience and possibility. Philosophy has long prepared us for this paradox. Marcus Aurelius taught that hardship reveals the essence of character and that surrender to pain allows strength to emerge. René Descartes showed us that doubt is not the end of truth, but the beginning of inquiry. Likewise, vulnerability is not the end of you. It is the start of rediscovering who you are and what you are capable of becoming. Faith brings this lesson to its most intimate expression. The Bible reminds us that God's strength is made perfect in weakness, not in the appearance of control. When you cry in silence, stripped of pretenses, you give space for hope to enter. Hope is not the denial of reality, it is the assurance that reality does not have the final word. Vulnerability opens the door, and God Himself steps through carrying the gift of hope. Think of the moments when you allowed yourself to be honest about your brokenness. Didn't you also sense a flicker of hope rising, even if faint? That is because hope is drawn to vulnerability. Like light entering through a crack, it does not need a wide opening to shine, it only needs permission. And when that light arrives, despair loses its grip, and the soul finds strength to continue. The meeting between vulnerability and hope is one of the greatest mysteries of human existence. It is the place where your tears turn into testimony, where your weakness reveals strength, and where your solitude becomes filled with the companionship of God. When God responds with presence and not with words. There are times when you cry out for answers, searching for explanations that never arrive. You want reasons, you want clarity, you want the pain to make sense. Yet instead of words, what you receive is silence. Silence that somehow feels full. Silence that carries a weight beyond comprehension. This is how God often responds, not with sentences but with His presence, a nearness that cannot be mistaken for emptiness. Psychology helps us understand why explanations often fail to heal. Judith S. Beck notes that intellectual answers rarely soothe emotional wounds because pain is not a puzzle to be solved, but an experience to be carried and transformed. Neuroscience echoes this truth. Andrew Huberman explains that the human brain craves certainty, but when it cannot find it, comfort is drawn from connection, from the felt sense that one is not alone. And in the spiritual realm, this connection comes as the quiet assurance of God's nearness, unspoken yet undeniable. The Stoics too recognized the futility of chasing explanations in moments of suffering. Epictetus taught that peace comes not from demanding reasons, but from accepting reality and aligning with what is greater than ourselves. Faith takes this wisdom deeper. God may not always explain the why, but He always offers the who, Himself. His presence becomes the answer that words could never contain. Think about the times when you prayed, desperate for an audible reply, but instead felt a sudden calm, a strange peace that settled on your heart. That was not absence. That was the language of presence. God does not always speak with words because words have limits. His presence bypasses intellect and goes straight to the soul, bringing rest to a heart that explanations could never soothe. When God responds with presence and not with words, He is teaching you that love is greater than logic, that comfort is deeper than clarity, and that His companionship is more powerful than any explanation. The silence you feared becomes the evidence of His nearness, the unspoken assurance that you are not forgotten. And in that realization, the weight of your pain begins to ease, not because the questions are answered, but because you no longer carry them alone. The invisible embrace that strengthens the soul. There are moments when no human arms are near, when the loneliness is so intense that it feels like even the air has withdrawn from your presence. Yet in the middle of that emptiness, something unexplainable happens. You sense a warmth, a calm pressure wrapping around you, not physical, but undeniable. This is the invisible embrace of God, and it has the power to strengthen your soul in ways that words or logic cannot. Psychology affirms the healing power of touch. Studies show that physical embrace lowers stress hormones, regulates the nervous system, and conveys safety. But what happens when there are no arms to hold you? Faith reveals that the soul is not limited to the body's senses. The invisible embrace functions in the same way, calming the heart and signaling to your entire being that you are not abandoned. David M. Clark reminds us that safety is as much a perception as it is a physical condition, and when the soul perceives God's nearness, the body responds as if it had been held. Philosophers like Montaigne saw comfort as something deeper than physical presence, something that arises when the soul feels aligned with truth. The Stoics taught that inner strength can be drawn from the recognition that we are never cut off from the larger order of existence. But faith takes this wisdom further. The embrace is not abstract, it is personal. It is the Creator Himself bending toward His creation, offering presence as comfort, strength, and renewal. Think of the times you cried in silence and suddenly felt as though a peace had descended, wrapping itself around you. That was not imagination. That was the invisible embrace of God, unseen but powerful, holding you steady when your strength was gone. It is an embrace that does not loosen its grip, one that shields your soul even when circumstances remain unchanged. The invisible embrace that strengthens the soul is not bound by time or space. It arrives quietly without demand and lingers as long as you need it. And when you recognize it for what it is, the despair that once crushed you loses its power, replaced by the unshakable truth that you are never without the arms of God surrounding you. Impactful conclusion: no one ever cries alone. Every tear you have shed in silence has been seen. Every sob muffled into the night has been heard. Every moment you thought you were abandoned was, in reality, a moment of profound companionship. Pain has tried to convince you that you are isolated, But the truth is deeper. No one ever cries alone. Your suffering is not ignored by heaven. It is held, honored, and transformed by the presence of God. Science tells us that tears restore balance to the body. Psychology reminds us that acknowledging pain creates paths to healing, and philosophy insists that struggle refines the soul. Yet faith weaves them all into a greater truth. God does not waste your pain. The silence you feared was never empty. It was sacred space filled with His nearness. The burden you thought would crush you was, in fact, shaping you. The loneliness you believed was your prison was actually an invitation into divine intimacy. Think of the countless moments you thought you had reached your end, and yet here you are. Survival is not random. Strength is not accidental. Peace, even if fragile, is evidence that you were carried through. Each tear you cried became part of a dialogue between your soul and your Creator. And in that dialogue, you discovered something life-changing. That God's presence does not merely watch from a distance. It sits beside you, embraces you, and turns your despair into resilience. So remember this: no cry is wasted, no silence is ignored, no pain is unseen. You are never abandoned in your tears. The presence of God is the constant companion that transforms suffering into meaning, weakness into strength, and sorrow into hope. No matter how dark the night feels, you are never crying alone.